Hello and welcome to another episode of the Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is all about recovery. So what we're going to try and do today is cover a few of the kind of most important aspects of recovery, why recovery is so important, and what kind of tips, strategy you can use from going to kind of finishing from the session, what nutrition, all those different aspects of what you can do to essentially, try and accelerate recovery or do a better job of recovering, or most importantly, really, is not impeding recovery. So what I will do, we'll start off with thinking about the importance of recovery. Now, I remember when thinking about recovery, one of the most important quotes that I think I ever heard was thinking about the fact that you can only train as much as you can recover from. That's quote number one. And two is more of a fact that you get stronger when you recover. That is the key thing. At the end of the day, training is not about making you stronger. Training, working hard, accumulating any kind of overload, apart from that, obviously that idea that we've talked about going to the skill element, when we talk in terms of actual physiological fitness development, what are we actually trying to do? We're really trying to push the body beyond its comfortable limits and then ask it to get stronger. Well, if you imagine that, it is the recovery element, the rest element, that actually is the getting stronger section. So, they're all different levels of recovery. I'm going to try and cover everything in this episode. So, I'll give you a quick kind of cliff notes if you're not able to listen to the whole episode. 1, recovery has priority. Essentially, recovery has priority over training. Sounds a bit distorted, but it's true. Is that, as I say, only train as much as you can recover from, and if you cannot afford the recovery, then you reflect the amount of training in that. Secondly, the recovery element is where you get strong, therefore don't be lulled into the idea that during those recovery sections, days, time, etc., that you've got to try and work harder and harder to basically either shorten or remove or reduce that recovery element, when that element is the bit that's essentially setting you up for the next session. Recovery comes in lots of forms, from the micro recovery that you would get between a workout, between an interval workout that ensures that the interval quality is important, to the kind of macro recovery over days, weeks and months. So it's important to consider all different elements of recovery. And finally, there's all those different factors that can factor in essentially to improving that recovery. But at the end of the day, all you really have to do is not mess up your body's own systems of trying to recover. So give it what it wants, when it wants it, ideally, and let it do its job, basically. And try not to essentially over-accelerate recovery, which sometimes can actually cause more problems. Okay, so when we're thinking about recovery, what are we actually doing? What actually is it? So on a physiological basis, you can just think of it, let's just make it really simple, of training increases overload, that increases stress, and recovery is that time when you rebuild. So what's actually going on? Well, we don't really fully understand all the different elements. We've tried to measure them all, and they all have different inputs into this. So it could be a muscle-related recovery, in that it's all about the muscle tissue repairing. It could be cell-related in terms of the mitochondria and the mitochondrial ability to recover from the time period where they were using lots of energy to essentially repair. I like to think of mitochondria a bit like a wood-burning furnace. So a wood-burning furnace burns happily all day, and the more energy you put into it, the more it puts out, the more energy it burns. But it's not going to last like that forever. It's going to need repair at some point, it's going to need cleaning out, and it's going to need possibly repair to its structure. And it is when it's not on and when it's been left to essentially cool down that it can be cleaned, that it can be repaired. And that's why you think of mitochondria. Now, that's one of the most important elements of recovery, could be not eating, i.e. the time period of fasting of overnight. And I've done a lot of talk about the time-restricted eating and why it could be so important. And the reason it probably is, particularly when it comes to exercise and recovery, is the fact that mitochondria, the cell bases, recover best when there's very little energy available. But I'll go into that a little bit more detail in another podcast because I don't want to get too much down to the weeds there. But bear in mind that time period when we're not eating is actually really quite important. So sometimes thinking about recovery as just simply trying to get food in trying to think about it as the kind of muscle recovery side of things is slightly counterproductive for long-term development. Okay, so let's say we've done a hard training session. What I'm going to try and do with these is address a few of the questions that were kind of thrown in via Twitter. So one of the questions was, what do we do in terms of recovery after a hard session to prepare us for the next? So it depends on the type of session, really, in that running is a slightly different thing from cycling. Now, what do you need for recovery? In order to optimize the next session, you probably need to get a bit more fuel on board. So dependent on how much fuel you've used during the session, whether you're kind of high and low on the kind of carbohydrate side of things might dictate how much you take in. So if you are a high carbohydrate athlete and you've done a long, hard draining session that is likely to have taken away a lot of glycogen, in order to prepare adequately for the next session, you're going to do best having some carbohydrates in. You're probably going to do best taking some protein as well, because there's probably going to be some element of increased muscle turnover. Not necessarily muscle damage, make note of that, and that's where the element of running side of things comes in. But possibly some more rough muscle turnover, so it probably is a good idea. The other thing about protein in regards to muscle is stimulating the kind of mTOR and muscle building pathways that you get from taking in a good amount of protein. That tends to occur at about 20 to 30 grams of protein based on the amount of leucine, a certain amino acid content. So having a good amount of protein in that region after a training session within maybe an hour or two, we don't think it's that critical particularly to get it in within the first 20 minutes or so, probably upregulates the processes involved in increasing muscle turnover, increasing that development of good quality lean mass that can often lead to greater performance. So, what about the extra caveats with regards to running? I've talked a lot in the past about the research by Keith Barr on gelatin and glycine and those side of things. It is important as a runner to consider that it's not just about muscle. When we're taking a lot of muscle meats, let's say a lot of chicken breast, we're taking a lot of amino acids in that help us repair the muscle, but they might not help us repair the connective tissues around the muscle. For those, we need things like glycine and proline and various other amino acids that are found in that connective tissue and found in collagen. Now, they tend to be in the things like the tendons and the bones of the chickens, let's say, for instance, or the animals, and in the skin and various other connective tissue elements that we don't tend to eat. So you can change this by consuming those elements of the animal, if you're having that as recovery, or you can get some gelatin. Relatively easy thing to do. Gelatin tends to come, in terms of the amino acids, it tends to come in three distinct types. You can either get the amino acids on their own, which is glycine, which doesn't really cover the whole picture because you need some proline and various other amino acids in there as well. But you can take that to essentially add a little bit extra supplement of glycine, which tends to be the most important and possibly the limiting step. You also need to get the gelatin in, or hydrolyzed collagen. Hydrolyzed collagen essentially is gelatin that has been broken down slightly further. It is often slightly kind on some people's stomachs who may find that a good load of gelatin doesn't sit particularly well on their stomach. But apart from that, they're pretty much the same thing. Gelatin tends to be cheaper. The product I tend to use is the Go Nutrition Gelatin found on Amazon because it doesn't have sulfur dioxide in. Most gelatin, your Dr. Oetker's, etc., will always have sulfur dioxide in, which is very nasty for the gut. So I tend to avoid that. The best quality stuff, though, if you're going to go for complete quality, is the Great Lakes Hydrolyzed Collagen that is available on Amazon. Very, very fine powder, very easy to mix in things, smoothies, drinks, etc. Very good for post-workout recovery, although the evidence is actually, when it comes to running, that you should probably be taking about 10 grams of it with a little bit of vitamin C about an hour before your workout. So if you take that before your workout, essentially what you're doing is you are accelerating the recovery after your workout by increasing that turnover into the collagen. So recovery can actually start leading up to workout as opposed to just when the workout's finished. So in terms of that, in terms of the nutritional side of recovery. In terms of the kind of carbohydrate and things, the other side to consider is long term. Now, health-wise, I'm an advocate of relatively low sugar, having good amounts of good quality fats in the diet, such as avocado, the typical kind of olive oil, good quality butter and saturated fat sources. Fish oils are extremely important. Fish oils are actually improve the uptake, and the paper's just come out, improve the uptake essentially of protein into the muscles and the muscle development. So definitely a good reason to get a good amount of oily fish, mackerel, salmon, sardines, your seafood, mussels, and possibly something like a krill oil supplement as an extra supplement as well if you really feel you need it. Bear in mind that when it comes to the omega-3 and these fish oils, it's all about balance. If you consume vegetable oils, rapeseed oil, or if you eat a fair amount of nuts and seeds, i.e. more than a small handful a day, then you definitely should consider extra supplementation or extra fish, because they are high in omega-6, which tend to cause a pro-inflammatory response if you have a bit too much of them. So it's all about balance. And that causes a lot of those changes in terms of recovery. So we should be in that. The idea is that exercise creates a lot of inflammation and damage, and then we go into a nice, easy recovery phase where we essentially take in a lot of those more kind of anti-inflammatory compounds. So that there's a lot that can be done on that, and I think I'll probably do a separate podcast all about the nutrition of recovery, but that's the kind of rough gist of it. The other thing to bear in mind, as I say, is that there's micro-recovery as well. When you're doing an interval session, consider how long you're having in terms of recovery and what you're trying to achieve. If you are trying to achieve the maximum amount of power in a given session, then it might be best to elongate the recovery. If you're trying to achieve the maximum amount of power in a particular interval. Or you could reduce the recovery if you are trying to achieve a general overload or something like the VO2 max overload, which actually tends to respond from less recovery and longer work intervals. And then we have obviously recovery in terms of day-to-day and sessions and that side of things. Now, when it comes to running, I think one of the best recovery things you can do is not sit down after a running session. So for half an hour to an hour, you don't sit down, you just move. Won't worry too much about stretching. I like to do some good kind of compound full body movements, squatting, crouching down, lunging, all movements taking the limbs through their range of motion. But I don't worry too much apart from that, and I definitely don't do any static stretching because I don't believe it helps. So I just tend to move a lot. But making sure you're doing that for a good half an hour to an hour after a run session helps recover, essentially get rid of any kind of build-up of the kind of metabolites that have been utilised and essentially waste products during respiration within the muscles. It helps to move things through the lymph vessels. It helps to stop that kind of feeling of being stuck together, but also hydration as well, making sure you're hydrating well with something, maybe a little food or maybe a little electrolyte basis, simply because, not because you necessarily need the electrolytes, but more the fact that if you drink a lot of pure water, it just essentially, that feeling if it goes straight through you, you don't absorb very much of it. So the best way to rehydrate is having something like milk, which does tend to cause more rehydration because it sticks around for a bit longer. You tend to get that longer infusion of fluid that helps recover. So that's the kind of way to think about after sessions. That would help to kind of prepare you for the next hard session. Now, how long should you leave between sessions? I've been asked that. Well, I believe that between running and essentially cycling and running, the evidence suggests that about 4 hours is the kind of minimum amount when it comes to the kind of neuromuscular patterning. I tend to go for the idea that either you run straight off the bike or you leave it for about 4 to 6 hours, and particularly if you're doing quality sessions. But it all depends on you. You've got to remember that if you're running later on in the day, you're going to have some kind of impact from the kind of neuromuscular side of things from being fatigued. So I often find what I like to do is actually essentially do swimming tends to be morning activity, running tends to be a morning first thing activity, and then biking tends to be later on in the day. I don't tend to do hard biking sessions and run later on in the day, mostly because running is far more neuromuscular and skill based, whereas cycling, being set in that position and being weight bearing, tends to help, or it tends to not be hindered by that neuromuscular side of things. So I tend to do the majority of my training with the run first thing in the day, then often the swim, and then often the biking. That tends to be how it works well for me, or often go down to the swimming pool, have the swim first thing. But the hard biking almost never comes first, because I often find that the run later in the day doesn't really complement that biking session particularly well. It doesn't develop on the skill level of running because I'm relatively neuromuscular fatigued. However, I will do at specific times, I will do running off the bike as a brick session to essentially acclimatise myself to racing. But when it comes to training, I tend to do the running earlier in the day than I do the hard biking, because I just find that works well for me. So in terms of recovery aids, there's lots of different recovery aids you can use. But at the end of the day, the key element of those recovery aids is to get you and your tissues moving. So does compression stuff work? Possibly. It essentially is a little bit of a shortcut. It's a bit of a hack, and it helps you when you're not being particularly active. If you can be more active, that is far better. So if you think about what compression stuff's trying to do, if you could put on some compression stuff or some these funky boot things, they're going to do nothing better than going out for a nice walk. But I guess some people would say, well, I don't have time for the walk, so if I can sit at my desk and put these things on, then great. Well, yes, in that situation, they are going to do a little bit of a kind of job towards the recovery side of things, but nothing that a nice, good, brisk walk wouldn't do as well. Getting moving is one of the best recovery tools you can do. So I was asked about whether to do a run on tired legs, and it does depend on how tired. Running is very different. That's the key thing. I say with recovery, when it comes to running, if you feel like your legs have no pop or snap in them at all, then have a nice walk instead. Because running at even a slow pace requires and puts a lot of stress on various different systems that may not be well catered for when you're very tired. The other key thing is, why are your legs tired? If they are tired because you have overloaded them, then you are probably due recovery time. And you're probably best taking that in the form of a nice walk. Most people cannot run easy enough or relaxed enough to really benefit from active recovery when it comes to running. I am a fan of frequency when it comes to running, but that if you are running on tired legs, you have essentially gone too long and too hard to make frequency work well for you. You should be able to run every single day, but then you shouldn't be run long enough or hard enough to essentially cause so much fatigue that you feel like you can't run very comfortably and easily the next day. That is my philosophy. You're better off doing lots and lots and lots of frequency and easy runs that always feel like they're relatively comfortable, as opposed to doing one beastly run where you're left in bits for days and wondering whether you should run at all on those. And yes, ideally you'd be running then, but if you're so beaten up that you can't, the next best thing, and the best thing is to work on those tissues and move them around, but not overload them with the impact force, and that is walking. Walking is the best thing you can ever do. And the thing about walking is it's habit driven. Why are you driving to the shops that's only a mile away? Why are you walking? Why are you driving anywhere that you can walk within 20, 30 minutes? I have no idea. And most athletes will train hard, then lie on the sofa and drive somewhere. Well, get in the habit of not using your car, wrapping up warm in this weather and going for a walk to get something, and almost create the situation. So let's say you need something from the butcher's. Rather than driving down there, make sure you've got time to walk there, pop in and get the things there. Or walking to, you're walking to go and get something, or you're walking to do errands. Add them in as much as you possibly can, and almost add them convoluted into your, don't think about it, right, we've got to go to this particular place and get everything we need from this place now. You could go there and then get something the next day, or walk to the supermarket the next day to get a couple of bits and pieces. Use it as a kind of a tool just to aid that recovery, but also just get you out and about all the time, and not think, use it as a kind of form of transport. That's probably the best advice I can give on that front. Now, I was asked about the kind of different elements of recovery for different kind of levels of intensity in terms of glycolytic and all those bits and pieces. And essentially the only separation when it comes to those really is the amount of glycogen you then need to refuel if you are focused on trying to improve the quality of the next session. Obviously, the more glycogen and sugar you're likely to have burned, the more you're going to likely need to refuel if you're trying to optimize the next session. But bear in mind that actually you might be best off not doing that all the time, because actually, whilst you might increase your short-term recovery in terms of that building element might be hampered by always refueling things immediately as much as you possibly can, because that's not what we'd have had available to us. And we actually might inhibit some of the longer-term adaptations. The same goes for things like the use of antioxidants, and that I don't believe almost any antioxidant supplement, vitamin C, vitamin E, all these things should ever be taken as a supplement or purely, particularly around exercise, because one, they tend to be well available in the diet, and particularly the kind of pro-oxidant effect of things like red wine that actually increase your own ability to make antioxidants, which I think is far better. But also they have been shown to inhibit the response and the essentially recovery from exercise by inhibiting that initial inflammatory response, which is why things like ibuprofen should be absolutely banned from every runner's list. they should never ever be taken in any circumstances because they significantly inhibit that recovery from exercise. So I hope that's giving you a few kind of tips there in terms of the recovery side of things. Hopefully that's answered a few of those questions. If you've got any more questions regarding around this, I'm probably going to do a little bit of podcasting on things like the nutrition and recovery in a bit more detail and maybe a few of those elements. But this gives you a bit of an overview, gives you a few of my thoughts, and hopefully give you something to think about over the next few days and next training sessions you're thinking about. Thank you very much, and goodbye.